Welcome everybody for the 2021 NBC EC Brown Bagger. I'm pleased to have the assistance of Dr. Dare Bullock at University of Kentucky and Matt Spangler at the University of Nebraska to put this program together each year. I think if I remember right, Dare, we're in our 18th or 19th year doing this. We've had a nice following over time and appreciate everybody's continual support and engagement in this Train the Trainer series. This first session is Dr. Sara Place, and her topic is going to be opportunities for genetic improvement of beef sustainability, and the kind of the lead-off speaker here in the series titled Genetic Improvement to Support Beef Sustainability. So we've had Darren, Matt, and I a lot of discussions about what sustainability might mean to both seed stock and cow-calf producers, and we thought that this year's Brown Bagger series would provide a nice forum to kind of develop some of those ideas and engage with our extension audience to kind of help think through how we might coach and advise seed stock and cow-calf producers around the country on genetic improvement, and particularly here related to sustainability topics. And so in a bit of departure from our typical format, we've only got one speaker in this lead-off session. That's Dr. Sara Place, and I'll introduce her more formally here in just a minute. But our reason for doing that was to provide and as you'll see, I have had a sneak peek at the slides, so I know what's coming. But Sarah's going to help sort of set the table for us, if you will, in terms of thinking about some of the core aspects of sustainability. And then she's been in a number of roles that provide her some really good perspective and visibility on how we might evolve as an industry to be more sustainable and more productive in our livestock production systems. So with that, again, welcome here to session one. My name is Bob Weber. I'm a host for today. I'm a faculty member here at Kansas State, and really glad to be engaged in this process of Train the Trainer programs. I do want to point everybody to the website. We will have, at the end of the series, we'll make the recordings and PDF copies of these slide decks available for viewing. So if you happen to not be able to attend one of the sessions, you don't have to email me or anything. We'll send out an email when all the stuff's posted at the end, and get those links in your inbox so you can view those at your leisure. And they'll be publicly available on the NBCEC website. Under this For Professionals tab, there's a Brown Bagger link that has an archive of not only this year's when they're done, but also all the previous year's content. So be sure to check that out as you have time. I also want to point you to a resource. Our Beef Sire Selection Manual has been recently updated in edition 3 now, and that's available for download. We also do have a pretty substantial number of print copies, so if you like those, you can contact Matt, Dare, or I, and we'll make sure we get some of those in your hands. They're great teaching aids and written really for seed stock and commercial producers in real practical language. So we hope you'll take us up on that offer. And with that, we'll get right into the meat of it. Again, session one here, titled Genetic Improvement to Support Beef Sustainability. And our speaker's topic for today is Opportunities for Genetic Improvement. And given by Dr. Sara Place. Sarah's Chief Sustainability Officer at Elanco, and there she provides technical expertise on sustainability issues to their customers and supports Elanco's Healthy Purpose initiative. Prior to Elanco, Sara was Senior Director of Sustainable Beef Production at the National Cattlemen's Sustainable Beef Production Research, an important piece in that title, at National Cattlemen's Beef Association. That's probably where I got to know you best, but I knew you first as a faculty member and assistant professor in beef sustainability at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater. Prior to that, Sara worked on her PhD in biology, where she received that from University of California, Davis, and has a bachelor's in animal science from Cornell University, so we're both Cornell alums. Good job, Sara. Spent some time there in Ithaca as well. And prior to that, she got an associate's arts degree in agriculture business from Morrisville State College, and that's part of the SUNY system, right?
Yes, it is. Yep.
In New York. And so Sarah's got a great background, and I'll add a little bit to her modest introduction. I think Sarah's maybe one of the most internationally recognized speakers in this space of beef sustainability. She's done a lot of work in modeling, and I think maybe more importantly, a lot of work communicating with producers to help us understand how we might be more engaged in sustainability topics. And I think has a real sort of practical and pragmatic approach to beef industry operations and improvement. So Sarah, we're just delighted as can be to have you join us today, and look forward to your comments. I'll pass remote control here to you. So you should have that, and the stage is yours. I might steal it back for 1 second while I turn off my video. We'll put the focus all on you. But again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your comments today.
Excellent. Thank you, Bob. Really appreciate it. Very kind introduction. And I'll get right to it, and we'll get started on this topic. So as Bob mentioned, right, we'll kind of go through this, and hopefully this will be a good setup for you all in this whole series when we're talking about sustainability. Sorry, a little bit of lag there on the slide advancement, but just to start off, I always think it's good for us to set the stage of what we're talking about when we talk about sustainability. And so this slide here is kind of an overview of one way to think about it from a food systems perspective. And if this terminology isn't necessarily new or is new to you, you haven't heard the idea of a food system before, this is often how it's discussed, especially internationally. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, the UN had a food systems summit. So this is a big topic internationally as well, all these issues of sustainability. So if we look at this diagram here, again, kind of a simplistic way of looking at it, but thinking about it from a Venn diagram model, we have different domains of sustainability that are important. And some of these issues here that are listed within each one of these domains, the environment, economic, and social, it's not an exhaustive list, right? But some of the things that can be important that we're trying to balance, right? So everything from environmental footprints, which would include carbon and water footprints, to social issues, everything from animal welfare to nutritional quality, and of course, economics, first and foremost, any system. Especially from that producer perspective, we have to be economically viable, right, from a long-term perspective. So we're trying to balance all these areas. Sometimes there are synergies where these domains overlap. Sometimes there are real trade-offs that need to be delineated. And the last thing I'll say on this is just thinking about part of the challenge of this entire space is that last bullet point over on the left-hand side of the slide of recognizing the real value judgments and uncertainty. Right, there's varying degrees of how certain we are about some of these estimates, especially in the environmental impact realm. And value judgments just meaning we know that people will value each one of these things differently, right? So this is usually where we kind of end up in these intractable debates at times, and sustainability is that people may agree all these things on the slide are important, but they're going to rank them differently. And that's what can lead to challenges of trying to get agreement across diverse groups of people on what a sustainable food system actually is, what the criteria are. So with all that said, all that complexity, I'm going to simplify things down quite a bit, right? And think about one of these central trade-offs or tensions, right? Again, this is quite simplified. But if we were just to think about the environmental footprint that really gets the most attention now that it seems, which is greenhouse gas emissions per pound of beef, right? So thinking about a carbon footprint. So again, a simplified diagram here on our hypothetical y-axis, we got a carbon footprint. And then on the x-axis, we're looking at thinking about increasing inputs, right, into the system. And, in aggregate, this is relatively true, right? Obviously, if we think about grain finishing cattle, using more human edible feeds and arable lands and potentially exogenous inputs that require fossil fuels in their manufacture, we tend to lower the carbon footprint of beef as we improve the efficiency of the system. But we have to use more of those inputs, right? And so this is one of those central tensions always in sustainability, especially as it comes to beef, is folks that are advocates for, only using forages, only grass finishing, moving animals to their feed sources rather than moving the feed to them. The challenge with that is your carbon footprint is going to be higher, right? And so the question is, and I think hopefully as you guys go through this series, is, how do we break ourselves out of this idea if this is only strictly a trade-off? And especially with the tool of genetics, how do we help lower the environmental footprint of beef production with the same, inputs, right? Or even fewer inputs into the system potentially via genetic improvement, right? Whether it's on the animal side or, of course, on the crop side and those inputs going into the system as well. And so I think that's one of those key things and a powerful tool that we really haven't used as much as we can, not anywhere close as much as we can in the beef industry. And so going forward, I think it's going to be incredibly important. So just to set this discussion off, we'll just kind of go through some of the key trends. None of this is going to be a big surprise to most of you folks on the line here, but just to set the stage as we go through this discussion. And though the topic is about sustainability in aggregate, I will kind of focus in on the climate piece just as, again, that gets so much attention, and especially for the beef industry. So just to start us off with some of this context, right? So here we have some trends over time from 1974 to last year. Just looking at total beef production. And what I've done here is looked at, all the federally inspected production based on animal type, right? So you kind of have this stacked area chart here. And then the line going through is the total head slaughtered, right? Again, from federally inspected slaughter. So the headline at the top, right? I think we're all aware of this, is that we're able to produce more beef with fewer total head in the system. So from an overall efficiency standpoint, that's a huge advancement in terms of reducing total resource requirements and likely reducing greenhouse gas emissions in total from the industry per unit of beef, right? And as we go through here, that will become more clear, right? But again, no surprise to anybody looking at this slide, right? Our fed heifers, fed steers are making up the majority of the beef in the U.S., followed by cows. And of course, this is beef and dairy cows together as we're looking at this slide. So what's a different way to look at this? We can think about it in terms of beef produced per animal. And this is maybe seems a little weird at first because I'm not talking about slaughter weights, right, for these different animals, but expressing it as pounds of beef carcass weight that are produced per live animal in three different ways. So starting off at the top, this kind of tan color is beef per cow, beef cow specifically. The darker blue, almost black looking color is beef per live animal. And here I'm taking out the beef cow, or the dairy cows and the dairy replacement heifers that are above 500 pounds. And then the lightest blue at the bottom is beef per live animal, right? So again, not a very comprehensive analysis, but just looking at the linear trends over time, right? Just so you can see what's been happening here. And we can see, of course, increases in all three of those different ways of expressing beef being produced per live animal within the United States. So why is that important? If we were to look at that relationship between beef per live animal and then what we call the emissions intensity. So this is direct greenhouse gas emissions that come from enteric methane, so the cow burps, if you will, and then any methane and nitrous oxide that comes from managed manure from beef cattle in the United States. So if we look at that ratio, that emission intensity versus beef per live animal, it's a pretty strong inverse relationship there, right? Whereas we're producing more beef per live animal, we tend to decrease the emission intensity of beef. And so that's fairly logical because, again, one of those emission categories that I'm talking about, those are really dependent on how many animals we have, right? So this fairly simplified metric of beef per live animal kind of captures, again, not only just the total carcass weight being produced for every finished steer or heifer in the U.S., but also a reflection somewhat of reproductive efficiency and other measures of a total beef herd, right? We're thinking about that total supporting herd and the maintenance requirements, if you will, that are required to produce beef. And another way to think about this, right, and this is one of our potential opportunities, and especially from a genetics perspective, is that, we know overall in the beef industry, we've selected animals that are, from a feedlot performance standpoint, going to gain more and that are larger, right, at the end of their life, right, produce more beef per animal. And of course, the consequence of that is that cows have also gotten bigger, right? So this is just one way to think about this. Of what I'm expressing here in the y-axis is cow weight as a percent of either finished heifers or finished steers, right, over time. And so the key takeaway here is, especially as you look at it from a steer perspective, right, that ratio hasn't really changed, right? So pretty aggregate view, right? But to try to back into this idea of, are we diluting out total herd maintenance costs as much as we possibly can? And I think that we have a lot of opportunity yet, again, to really think about that in new ways and decrease those maintenance energy costs, but then also the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that maintenance of the total herd per unit of beef that we're producing from the herd. So again, those are just some high-level trends, some context, and hopefully that'll make sense as we come back around as I go through this presentation and thinking about what are some of those opportunities on the table. But as I mentioned, right, I'm going to kind of go a little bit deeper into climate, just because this tends to be the big issue that the beef faces, right, in the public arena in terms of questions about how sustainable is beef production. So it's good to start off just with some of the basics of climate change, right? I sometimes think we forget to start there of why are we even talking about this issue, right? And ultimately, it's about the rate of change of temperature on planet Earth. And I know this chart is incredibly busy, right? But just to set this up, this is from the recent working group report that just came out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so just a couple of months ago. And what we're looking at on the y-axis here is global surface temperature relative to, as you guys can see, right in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, so 1850 to 1900. So the deviation from that point in time of global average temperature. And then our x-axis is kind of broken in a few different places, right? So pay attention to that. We start on the far left at 60 million years ago from the present day to today, right? And the key things here is that essentially right after the big asteroid took out a lot of the dinosaurs or sent them on their evolutionary path to become, the birds of today, if you will, right? It was a lot warmer on planet Earth than it is today, right? Significantly warmer. So there's been a lot of change in terms of the global climate over geologic timescales, right? This is 60 million years of a 4.5 billion year old planet, right? Just keeping that in context. But in the recent climate history, we've gone through this back and forth, kind of represented by this green section of glacial and interglacial periods, right? Ice ages and then warm periods that we call these interglacial periods, okay? And essentially, as you go all the way over to the far right, you think about this purple chunk, this is really relevant to humans, right? Because essentially we've only been a species for, somewhere around 200,000 years, and all of human civilization has happened in the last roughly 10,000 years, right? So all of the things that we think of associating with humanity have happened in a pretty narrow slice of an interglacial period on planet Earth, a relatively stable climate period. And this is why there's so much attention around climate change, right? Because we can see on the way far right, these are some of those projections of where temperature could go. So again, it's not that higher temperatures would be unprecedented. It's just rather the rate of change and then the rapid implications of that, or the implications of such a rapid change of temperature. Really, that's what we care about when we're talking about human-caused climate change. And so what about this climate change and the greenhouse effect, right? I think, again, this is pretty basic, but just starting with those basics of what are we talking about when we talk about the greenhouse effect? Essentially, the very thin layer of our atmosphere does have that heat trapping ability from greenhouse gases that are within the troposphere, within the lower portions of the atmosphere. Essentially, solar radiation from 93 million miles away, it hits the Earth's surface, it gets reflected back up. Some of it gets trapped in the Earth's atmosphere and re-radiated back out in all directions, including back down to Earth. And as kind of these headlines over on the left-hand side say, right, essentially the global average temperature is far warmer because of these greenhouse gas emissions or greenhouse gases in the atmosphere than it would be without them, right? So again, the greenhouse effect is essential. It's just the question of, are we changing it in ways that are would disadvantage ourselves and other life on Earth, right, in terms of the rapid change over time. So there are different greenhouse gases. We're going to go through some of them here. What's key is that, there are natural, if you will, greenhouse gases that don't get included in budgets. The key one there is water vapor, which is one of the most important greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We don't usually include it or talk about it when we're talking about human-caused climate change because we're not able to really control water vapor, but it is one of those positive feedback loops potentially as the Earth gets warmer, more water vapor goes in the atmosphere, right? So what about some of those key emissions that we can control and then how it affects concentrations in the atmosphere? The big one is carbon dioxide, right? So carbon dioxide and the concentrations in the atmosphere, they've gone up a lot, right? Again, this is coming from NASA in terms of the changes over time. And what this chart is showing over on the right-hand side of the slide is just, again, 0 being on the far right-hand side is today. So we're over 415 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And then going back over time, 800,000 years, right? So there's a fairly strong correlation between the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere and these interglacial and glacial periods, right? But again, hopefully it's fairly apparent in the recent changes that's taken place from 1950 to now. Ultimately, where is the CO2 coming from? It's coming from burning fossil fuels, right? This is a pretty straightforward conservation of mass, first law of thermodynamics problem, right? When we look at the total global fossil fuel consumption over time, and this is what we're looking at here on this chart, units is a little bit different, right? This is looking at it from an energy perspective measured in terawatt hours, but it correlates strongly with the mass of carbon that's also been released. Going from 1800 to 2019, we can see a tremendous increase in the amount of fossil fuels that have been burnt, especially since 1950. Essentially since 1970, we've burnt half of all the fossil fuels that we've burnt in all of human history, right? So that carbon has to go somewhere. A lot of it has been absorbed by the oceans, actually, and there has been a global greening effect where we've seen increases in photosynthetic activity. But there's been carbon left over, and so that has been the balance, or in increasing the balance, if you will, of CO2 in the atmosphere. So that's a fairly straightforward relationship. As we burn fossil fuels, we have increased CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. The second most important greenhouse gas is methane, and this one's very relevant to the discussion today because this is the primary gas that makes up the emission profile of beef. But methane has also experienced an increase over time as well. So here it's a shorter time scale. We're looking, not to confuse you, but on the far right-hand side, this is actually now the years at the bottom. So close to today and then going back to 0 AD, right? So again, historical record and collections from Antarctic ice samples to collections from the atmosphere in more recent times. But what we see is that the increasing concentration of methane follows pretty similarly to the pattern of CO2, right? Up 150% since the start of the Industrial Revolution in 1750. So where is that coming from, or what are the sources of methane? The methane budget is a little more complicated, I guess I would say, than the human CO2 budget. That's a lot more straightforward, right? It's clear where we're disrupting the carbon cycle from a CO2 perspective. We're burning fossil fuels and land use change affects it. Methane is, as I say, a little more complicated. So again, I know a busy slide, but what's going on here is we're looking at a global budget for methane emissions and methane sinks, right? So starting from the left-hand side, going over, these are emission categories that would be considered human-caused or anthropogenic. So of course, fossil fuel production and use, just as with fossil fuel combustion, is a source of methane. So think natural gas, obviously, which is mostly methane, leaks from systems, leaks from wells, leaks from even coal mining is a big source of methane in the atmosphere. We also have agriculture and waste. That's a pretty big category, right? So everything from rice production to ruminants to manure to, even landfills, right, would be lumped into this category globally. Then we have biomass, biofuel burning, relatively more minor. Natural sources like wetlands, inland waters, termites, right? Any other ruminant animal that's wild, that's not domesticated. And then finally, on the far right-hand side, we have sinks. And this is super important, right? There's sinks for carbon dioxide as well, of course, as I mentioned, right? Like our oceans and the plant matter that takes it up. But the major sink for methane is actually the atmosphere itself. So methane mostly gets oxidized in the atmosphere by hydroxyl radicals for a whole series of processes and has a half-life of roughly 10 to 12 years, where most of the methane that gets emitted from any of these sources on the left-hand side of the screen will roughly get broken down. Most of it will get broken down again in 10 or 12 years. The soil also has some capability of breaking down methane, or specifically methanotrophic organisms in soils can do it. But again, the sink is the big source. So I spent a lot of time on this, but this is important just even going forward and thinking about methane. That short-lived cycling of it is incredibly important. So if you think about this as a balance sheet on our budget, right, if we want to change the rate of atmospheric abundance, which is in that red block up at the top, we can't really do much about the sinks, right? That kind of is what it is, and the amount of hydroxyl radicals in the atmosphere is not something that we can change greatly, nor really the soil aspect of it. But we can change our emissions, right? And if we change methane emissions, hopefully it makes sense because the molecule itself is breaking down so rapidly, the atmospheric change or the abundance will be seen a lot more quickly than, say, CO2, for example. Just because of its short-lived nature. And I'll expand on that more, but again, this is just important from that standpoint to understand there's sources and there's sinks, and there's a lot of uncertainty still. That's what these numbers are on this slide of. There's a pretty big range in the estimates of where we think these emission sources are. So a little bit more context in here, specifically getting into what are some of these sources from human activities? How large are these sources relatively, and how have they changed over time? If we're going to look at greenhouse gas emission trends in general, we can look at this from 1990 to close to today. And this is a global perspective, putting all these gases on a carbon dioxide equivalence basis, and more on that later of, it's one way to compare these gases, right? But the key thing is if we look at these different categories, the agricultural piece really can be summed up as agriculture total at the bottom, which would be all the direct emissions from livestock and all direct emissions from crop production, and then ag land use, which would include, nitrous oxide emissions from soil, but also land use change or any of those aspects, right? So really, we can add together those two blue chunks on the bottom and say that's the total food system, if you will, contribution, or food and fiber system contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. What's key is looking at that, of course, over time, it's actually pretty flat. It's actually slightly decreased if you add those two categories together, which I think probably is counterintuitive to most people. If you just follow the media, you would think it's ever increasing globally, right? But it hasn't been. And that's actually a pretty remarkable achievement when you think about the stats that are at the top, right? The human population is up 42%, yet we've kept the food and fiber system's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions relatively stable year over year. And we've increased the amount of food and calories just in general available to people around the world, right? So that's pretty awesome from that standpoint. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to shrink those bars more, but that is important context in this whole conversation. What really has increased, though, is the energy in the fossil fossil greenhouse gas emissions, right? So hopefully that's pretty clear. Again, if we're going to look at the major disruptor to the global carbon cycle, it is burning fossil fuels in general is where that's coming from. That's also just followed human population growth, right? There's been, so slightly more increase in population than emissions. So that's a very slight decoupling. But I also wanted to say, I mean, obviously energy use and fossil fuel emissions obviously have huge positives as well in terms of allowing countries to develop, right? It's not all negative. There's lots of positives associated with that increase as well. So if we think about it from a beef perspective, right, I don't think I've included the slide in here, but if we were to look at global beef production in aggregate from a life cycle perspective, according to the FAO, it's about 6% of global emissions, which is a fairly big chunk for one sector, right? But a lot of that is actually coming from deforestation in places like Brazil that get attributed to beef production. Right. So, but just keep that in mind. That's a life cycle number. All feed, everything going together is roughly the global number for beef. That said, using one global average and then applying it to different countries is a little bit nonsensical. And hopefully this slide makes that clear, right? Because there's tremendous variation around the world in terms of the environmental impact per unit of beef, depending on where you are. So this is one illustration of this and just highlighting the scale down there at the bottom. Essentially, the dark green colors, like in North America and Western Europe, tend to have lower carbon footprints. The lighter green color, like in South America, parts of Southeast Asia, kind of intermediate. The purple colors on the map is where we can have carbon footprints that are 50 times plus greater than they are in the United States, right? So huge variation around the world. That also means there's huge opportunity, right, to reduce the environmental impact and specifically the carbon emissions per unit of beef around the world. And a lot of this comes back to that pretty simplified relationship that I started off with, right, of just saying how much beef is produced per live animal. The great example there is just the U.S. versus Brazil, number one and number two beef producers in the world. The U.S. makes roughly 4 to 5 billion pounds more beef per year than Brazil. But we have a cattle herd size that's less than half of what Brazil's is, right? So again, Brazil, twice as many cattle, and they make less beef than the United States, and that's why they have higher greenhouse gas emissions per unit of beef, right? There's just more maintenance requirements, more enteric methane, more manure, more feed requirements to produce the same amount of human nutrition out of their cattle herd because of that. And this, again, is not to say anything bad about those countries in purple, right? Sometimes these countries have livestock for other reasons, right? These animals are more a source of equity, first and foremost, than they are production animals for producing food in many cases. And the last thing I'll say on here is just even from a genetics perspective or systems perspective, something to think about. You may be wondering, why is Europe so low in terms of their beef footprint? And part of this is a bit of an accounting issue, and not really an issue, but just the reality that a higher percent of the beef being produced in most of Europe is actually coming from the dairy herd as compared to beef cattle specifically, right? So because of that dual purpose use and the benefit to spread those emissions over two products, you tend to get a lower footprint in those countries where dairy beef makes a higher proportion of the herd as compared to a place like the United States or say Australia, right, where you maybe have more of the beef coming from true beef cattle. If we were to zoom in on the US and just look at EPA estimates of emissions that directly come from different sectors of the US economy, agriculture is around 9 to 10% of emissions on an annual basis, depending on how we allocate fossil fuel emissions to agriculture and to use of tractors and things like that, right? You'll note in this agriculture breakdown, actually plant ag emits more than animal ag directly. And this is because most of that plant ag emission is nitrous oxide emissions that come from soil. If we looked at it from a life cycle perspective, that proportionality would flip, right? Because a lot of those crops are being fed to animals. But again, it just highlights the complexity there of where do you actually allocate those emissions, right? It all depends on the categorization. I put landfills on here just because landfills are really, you can think about them as somewhat connected to the food system as well. The number one source of material that goes into landfills that drives methane emissions, that is what that is, that 1.7% is food waste, right? So from that standpoint, food waste is kind of a double whammy where one, it represents food and a lot of inputs and efforts into producing food that doesn't actually get fed to anyone and doesn't lead to human nourishment. But then it depends on the disposal of food waste, right? It can further exacerbate problems if we just throw it into a landfill and don't find alternative uses that don't lead to yet more methane production, right? But similar to that story of the global emissions piece, right? It's even more pronounced in the United States where fossil fuel emissions is really what dominates our emissions profile. Transportation, electricity, I've just lumped everything in of all other human-caused emissions. That includes commercial and residential emissions, right? Oil furnaces and things like that. That really makes up the bulk of the emissions in the United States. So again, it's not that we shouldn't be working on this proportion that agriculture contributes. It's just putting it in context, right? It's not the major source of emissions in the United States. So if we zoom in even further into the beef piece, and now I'm kind of mixing the terminology a little bit here. Now I'm saying, okay, let's look at the climate balance sheet, if you will, for beef from a life cycle perspective. Okay, so over on the left-hand side, we kind of have our generalized breakdown of where the emissions are coming from. And then on the right-hand side, the potential to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and essentially our sinks that are related to beef cattle production. So if we look at the left-hand side, these all added up, and that's really what that little note is at the top. If you added all the emissions up, the roughly 243 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents that get emitted from the U.S. beef industry, it's about 3.7% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. So again, it's not huge, but it is significant in terms of it's a single source that contributes. At the same time, though, a lot of that is not the emissions that directly come from the cattle. Right? It's tied up in feed and other inputs. I think what always surprises some people, especially folks in the dairy industry, is that manure emissions, especially manure methane emissions, are very minor from the beef cattle industry. And really, our methane emissions in the beef industry are dominated by enteric methane, with most of those coming from the grazing portions of the industry, right, from cow-calf production. Feed is also significant, as is just all the input emissions, what we call upstream emissions that are embedded in inputs that we use within beef cattle production. So this type of accounting happens fairly readily in terms of life cycle assessment, but the piece that has always got a lot of question marks on it is the right-hand side of this equation, which is, how much carbon sequestration is potentially happening on pasture and rangelands, or additionally, potentially on croplands that are growing crops that are going to be fed to cattle, right? And these are some of our, I would say, the bigger unanswered questions is getting our arms around that. When it comes to strict carbon accounting, though, part of the challenge here is that for carbon sequestration to move down that 3.7% number, it has to show additional carbon sequestration from a year over a year. So meaning each year you have to add more carbon stocks to the soil, for example, to demonstrate that you truly are pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting it in a more permanent store where it's not contributing to, again, that reinforcing the warming effect. But again, if you put those two pieces together, ultimately when we're talking about climate change, we're trying to reduce emissions, maintain enhanced sinks, and hopefully get ourselves to a point where we're more neutral in terms of any impacts on the climate. So, we've already given you guys a lot on this, but just to go a little bit deeper into some of this, right? And even that prior slide where I'm giving you that 3.7% number, as I mentioned, that's using what we call carbon dioxide equivalence, which is derived by using 100-year global warming potentials for different gases. So to back up a little bit, our reference gas typically in the climate space is always carbon dioxide. And so on a 100-year basis, methane is given a global warming potential, depends on the one you use, but roughly about 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 100-year period, and nitrous oxide roughly 265 times more potent than carbon dioxide. The challenge with that, though, is kind of back to that methane budget that I shared with you all, right? If you think about methane, it's got such a short half-life relative to these other gases that 100-year integration of its warming impact, it works in some cases. It works when emissions are increasing. 100-year global warming potential works pretty well. They're reflecting reality of how emissions impact warming. But if you get into a situation where methane emissions are stable or methane emissions are declining, that 100-year global warming potential doesn't do a very good job of actually linking how emissions impact the climate, which at the end of the day is what we actually care about, right? Back to that chart of global temperature. That's the outcome that we're actually chasing, the one that we want to better represent. So there's been some interesting research out of Oxford University, which is what these couple of screenshots here are highlighting, right? This one, Net Zero for Agriculture, did a nice job in a short amount of space, just four pages of trying to explain this metric. And there's a series of publications now out that go a lot more deep into how this metric is calculated. But basically, this team has come up with an alternative to this GWP 100, mainly just to overcome the issues that I highlighted, right? That they've created a metric that works in all cases, whether methane emissions are increasing, whether they're stable, or whether they're declining, which is ultimately what we want, right? A metric that's fit for purpose, if you will, and does a good job of linking emissions to temperature change. So just to highlight this a little bit more, right? Like why does this matter, right? Essentially, it's because, again, methane is so short-lived, or we can say it's really a flow gas, if you will, which is different than CO2, right? Especially fossil CO2 emissions. Essentially, every time any of us get in our car and we drive or we fly somewhere, we're contributing to increasing the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. Every time carbon gets emitted, it adds to the stock that's in the atmosphere, right? So this is just demonstrated here, right? If we think about 1 year's emissions as one of these blocks, if we emit the same amount next year, it just stacks up into that stock in the atmosphere. Same thing year over year, year 3, year 4 or 5. It's just going to keep increasing. And think back to that chart that I showed you. Really, that's what's happening, right? If we burn more fossil carbon, it doesn't have anywhere to go. Conservation of mass, it's going to build up into the atmosphere just because we're emitting far more than is being removed by our sinks. With methane, if our flow gas of methane is in balance with the removal rate of the sink, essentially we can emit the same amount of methane every single year, and it will not add to the stock of methane in the atmosphere, right? And again, I know this is maybe somewhat of a weird concept if it's the first time you're thinking about it, but really, again, the concentrations in the atmosphere are what matter with climate change, because that's what actually changes the heat trapping potential of the atmosphere. So the takeaway of this is, if emissions and sinks are in balance, this flow gas technique is really, or flow gas concept is really important. Again, that comes back to that GWP star metric, which does a much better job reflecting how emissions actually impact warming. So to sum all this up, right, what's the so what of all this, of everything I just told you, right? Ultimately, these new metrics, they just better reflect the reality of how emissions, methane emissions specifically, and short-lived gases impact temperature. And again, that's what we actually care about when we're talking about climate change. It also highlights that methane emissions themselves do not have to reach zero to reach quote unquote climate neutrality. And here we're thinking about climate neutrality as not contributing to any additional warming from whatever this activity is, or achieving net zero warming. And again, that sounds confusing. And if you follow any of the public announcements that are out there, right, there's so many different terms that get thrown out there. What's really key is that this is not some sort of misrepresentation of reality, right? When people talk about net zero CO2 emissions, ultimately the reason they're talking about that is because they're trying to achieve a point of not contributing to additional warming. But it will take us with CO2 to get to zero emissions or net zero emissions to not have any more warming. Whereas with methane, they do not have to achieve zero to get there. So all this complexity is super important for beef and for cattle because it's the largest greenhouse gas emission in the emission profile for beef, right? It's not the only one associated though, which is also important as we can't ignore those other gaseous emissions that are coming from beef cattle production from more of a life cycle perspective. So if the goal for U.S. beef is climate neutrality, which the U.S. beef industry has said that they want to be climate neutral, what is some ways that could look, or how could that potentially happen going forward? And this is a very high-level summary of this, but just to kind of give an idea, right? One hypothetical. So what we're looking at here is these different components or these different parameters in this case study example, and comparing 2020 to 2050, right? And then there's the percent change in each one of these. And so in this scenario, I held the cattle herd constant, roughly, okay, from 2020 to 2050. But I said, hey, you know what? Beef production is still going to increase. We're still going to remain on this pathway of increasing beef production per animal, roughly the same rate of change as the prior 30 years. But what's going to happen now is we're going to have to truly decouple beef production from emissions, right? So beef cattle enteric methane is going to have to go down in total. And I've kind of broken out here what that would mean for feedlot cattle. So if we're roughly emitting about 127 grams per head per day for feedlot cattle, we're going to have to get to 91, right, by 2050. Same thing with beef cows. We're going to have to lower it by about 60 grams per day for the entire herd. Or, you could think about it differently and say, hey, some of the herd maintains their methane production, but a certain portion of the herd becomes a lower emitting cow herd. But we also have to reduce all the other emissions too. And I think this is key, right? You can't really, it's very difficult to just get there with only methane emissions reductions. You're probably also going to have to reduce all those input emissions and everything else that I kind of went through with the climate budget, if you will, of beef. And the carbon footprint in this case of beef would have to drop about 35%. So that's emissions per unit of beef, and then total emissions would also have to go down. So all that said, these are some of the changes at a high level. What does that look like graphically? This is one way to look at it. And I'll just click through here of the different changes. Oh, one too many clicks. So what we're looking at on this slide is on the y-axis, beef cattle production greenhouse gas emissions expressed as million metric tons of CO2 warming equivalents. So this is using GWP star. And then going from 2010 looking forward to 2050, right? And I've kind of blocked off here just to try to highlight what are some of those major changes, right, in percent per year reductions in total emissions from each one of these categories in these different years. And you can see essentially an increasing aggressiveness, if you will, in reducing emissions, assuming we have better technology, better methods to actually reduce emissions as we go forward. So again, completely hypothetical, but in this case, by about 2047, you hit a point where this total emissions amount goes below zero, right? And so here we are hitting no additional warming. Prior to that, of course, in all these cases where we have a positive value, the industry is contributing to warming, right? So again, it takes till that point with these fairly aggressive changes until you hit that point of no additional warming. And this is, again, from more of a life cycle perspective. It's probably pretty small at the bottom, but the blue chunk here are all the indirect emissions, right? And that's really important. We have to think about those as well if we're going to talk about climate neutrality for beef. So what would be needed? If we're going to actually do this and still produce more beef and maintain roughly the same size of the cattle herd, right? Because some of the folks that don't like beef would just say, well, we should just reduce the number of cattle, and that would get you there a lot quicker, right? But if we actually want to keep producing more beef to be able to export around the world to still meet demand within the United States, we're going to need to do things that are pretty big departures from normal, which is reduce emissions per head, not just per pound of beef, right? So we of course, on a footprint basis, we always like to talk about it per unit of production, per pound of beef, per kilogram of beef. But in this case, it really is the absolute emissions or the total emissions that matter when it comes to climate neutrality. So we are going to have to reduce the total emissions per head as well. That's not impossible though, right? And I think there are a lot of different levers we can pull. We think about enteric methane. One of the ones that I think is really, really key is genetics, right? Whether it's thinking about it through a feed intake perspective, and a feed efficiency perspective. I know there's so many ways you can slice that, right? That's a whole nother discussion. Or some of the early research would suggest there's probably a heritable component of even just methane emissions per head, independent even of feed intake as well, right? And I think that's one of those things for us to exploit and collect a lot more data on and say, hey, can this become part of a selection index in the future, which is really important because I think it's going to help us on the grazing cattle side, right? That point below, there's a lot of attention to feed additives, to feeding strategies, red seaweed, 3-NOP, all these things, which are very effective, or 3-NOP is in particular. But how do you get that out to all the mama cows out on the landscape, right? To all the cattle out on rangelands. And I think that's where genetics can be really key in terms of creating permanent reductions in emissions per head through genetic selection over generations, right? There are other ways we could possibly do this, right? There's always interest in saying, hey, can you create a vaccine? Theoretically, that's possible, and it's fairly difficult, but there could be other strategies out there as well. But again, I think genetics is a huge opportunity for us to tackle this challenge of the climate impacts of beef directly. But that said, right, like I said, I don't think just enteric methane reductions are going to help get us there alone, right? Realistically, we're probably going to need reductions in other areas, whether that's through the impacts of feed production, and if all the commitments that have been made on how we're going to reduce the impact of row crop production come true, then that should happen, right? Reducing any of our energy or fuel emissions or any of those inputs is going to be needed as well, right? And I think carbon sequestration is a huge just question mark in all of this, is that, it really is dependent upon how well can we document this, what are going to be the methods of saying that we're capturing additional carbon stores in the ground every single year. And it's, as I put in here, right, it's highly dependent upon the climate, the land's prior use, right? We can see very clear examples if you're, say, in the eastern U.S. and you take cropland that's been pretty well degraded and you reestablish pastures, you're probably going to sequester a whole bunch of carbon, right? But what about those scenarios of rangelands that have been rangelands for a long time, right? What is our ability to move the needle in those cases is probably not as great, right? It's just the reality. And then I put here this consideration. I think this is one of these things that, as this whole discussion of carbon offsets and carbon credit buyers, different industries comes into play. This is a very important consideration for the beef supply chain to think about, is that if the beef industry has set its own goals about climate neutrality, or the beef value chain, different actors have set those goals, what happens if, say, Delta Airlines buys the carbon credits off a ranch, right, in terms of its soil carbon sequestration? In that case, those carbon credits now cannot be claimed by the beef industry, right, because they've been sold to another industry. And I think some of those accounting issues are super important to keep in mind as well. You can't double count some of these credits that get generated. So, bottom line of all this, climate neutrality and this movement towards talking about this, it's possible. It's technically feasible, but it's going to require change from business as usual, right? On the current trajectory that we're on, I don't think you could claim that we're going to achieve climate neutrality because when you take a full life cycle perspective, we'd have to offset all those indirect impacts of beef cattle production. And so that's a key consideration. The other thing, though, is first and foremost, we can't lose focus of the other aspects of sustainability, right? I think it's great that the industry is moving towards trying to show it's solutions oriented, but first and foremost, right, we can't lose sight of economic viability. The fact that at the end of the day, this industry is producing food, right? It's absolutely essential for people in many different ways, and it has all these other benefits that usually get underappreciated, right, in terms of from wildlife habitat to just the land management benefits that cattle provide, right? So that's another key consideration of back to that initial Venn diagram I showed you and all the trade-offs that exist when we're talking about this. So I've been talking at you for a long time, but just a bottom line to kind of sum this all up, right? Again, thinking about that what is sustainability for beef? It's about balancing all three of these areas, right? It's about producing safe, nutritious, high quality food with social responsibility and environmental stewardship. It's a pretty broad definition, but that's because it's going to look different for every single operation, right? It's more about just getting better over time. And again, not losing sight of those key things that at the end of the day, we're producing high quality food for people, and these cattle provide more than just food, right? So as we're working on reducing environmental impacts like greenhouse gas emissions, we just need to balance that out. And then when we think about our opportunities, whether it's animal health and well-being or genetics, these are really key levers that we have to pull to reduce environmental impacts and reduce inputs required for every unit of beef that we produce. And hopefully I made the case clear that methane emissions is a real opportunity, I would say, for ruminant ag to really accelerate its path to climate neutrality a lot quicker. And again, that short-lived nature of methane is becoming more well understood, and it's still going to be a bit of an education process in the broader climate community, but I think there's getting to be more acceptance of this new way of thinking about methane going forward. So with that said, I will stop talking, and hopefully we have some time for questions, or if there are any, happy to take them.
Great, Sarah. Thank you. That was fantastic. The one thing I forgot to give everybody the heads up on, and I've not looked at the chat yet, but if you would post your questions in that Q&A box, that'll spool or queue them up for us to work through. And Sandy Johnson, thanks so much for putting that first one out for us real quick. She says, I know your focus has been U.S. beef, but do you have any comments about beef production in the purple portions of your global map or world map, and how that production may or may not change?
Yep.
So great observation, Sandy. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think in those cases, it's sometimes not even necessarily huge new innovations, but rather how do we adapt things that we know in other parts of the world to those situations, right? While also recognizing there's probably reasons why things are the way they are in certain countries, right? I think if you think about that map, the Indian subcontinent definitely highlights itself, right? There's some unique challenges and different attributes, obviously, of the culture there that are different, and just that herd being much more dairy focused. And a lot of the quote unquote beef in that chart is, quite frankly, water buffalo, right? And so that's part of it as well. But I think it really is some of those basics of animal health, better nutrition for animals, right? Quite frankly, even before putting a lot of selection pressure on genetics, of just making sure those animals have an environment where they can truly express all their genetic potential is really key in a lot of those different places, right? So in many of those cases, it's more of the animal husbandry, and then when you get to places like the U.S. and Europe, where we've kind of exploited a lot of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, that's where we get into these more innovations that kind of push the frontier of what's possible, right, in terms of emissions reductions.
Yeah, great, Sarah. I think the the really interesting bit is, as we think about global beef demand, how and U.S. beef production, if we become neutral, right, our product becomes more desirable, presumably, to global customers. And I think long run, that's good for our beef business, right? In terms of we already know how important the export trade is, but opportunities to top line grow beef production in an environmentally sensitive and responsible way is, I think, a really unique position for our business. So.
Absolutely. Yep.
Sandy follows up here. Perhaps the question is more, how likely will they make those improvements in efficiency? Great question. Yeah, some real challenges globally, right?
Yeah.
As we think about access to technology and economic opportunity for people to invest in technology very substantially. And if you've not been to sub-Saharan Africa, you should go.
Right. Yeah, I think that's almost I'm not qualified to answer that, Sandy, even though that's a good question of what will drive that. I think at the end of the day, though, it is more investment within the industry, right? And I think that's one of these central tensions that we have right now is some of the movement to reduce emissions from livestock production is quite frankly to reduce livestock or reduce investment into the livestock industries. And I think that's actually the opposite of what needs to happen if we really want to reduce environmental impacts, right? So I think that's the key thing is just making sure that we have the opportunity for folks to develop their industry more to be able to achieve that efficiency.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting perspective, Sarah, particularly with some of the environmental movement here in the U.S. The 30 by 30 sort of one that proposes returning a buffalo or bison to large portions of the northern Great Plains. Okay, so we do that, but those animals emit methane too. So we don't get any likely as much food product out of that system. So there's a lot of antagonisms and different competing interests that play here in the space. So
yeah.
One of the ones, and certainly folks chime in here with questions for Sarah. One of the points on your slide that I thought was really important, and I won't say you undersold it, but I think it deserves an exclamation point at the end of it. And it's that our grazing cows, the foundation factory of beef production in the U.S. generates, I can't remember, is 82% of methane emissions. And, I think most of the time we always, it's easy to associate sort of nutrient management, pollution stuff with feeding sector and not cow-calf sector. And if we think about, methane production and greenhouse gas emissions, big chunk from this cow side. And so I really appreciated your point about a variety of production practices that just basic improvements in reproductive performance of cows positively impact our neutrality position because we don't waste emission, if you will. That's not the right way to say that, but we get a product back in to offset that investment in greenhouse gas emission, if you will. So.
Obviously we know open cows from a economic perspective are costly, but they're also very costly from an environmental perspective, right? And that's things like reproductive efficiency aren't usually top of people's mind when they think about how can we lower the footprint further of beef production, right? But all those different attributes are super important, right? So there's some synergies there of thinking about how do you fit animals to their environment, right? And allow them to thrive and have fewer inputs going into those systems, and also the overall impact that can have on the emissions from the industry.
Yeah.
Hey, Bob, there's a question in the chat.
Oh, super. Thanks, Dare, for pointing us that way. Let's look over there. This one's from Miranda. It says, what genetic traits do you think provide the easiest place to make rapid change versus a more complicated solution that will take more time?
Yeah. Well, I think the key thing is for beef is probably even just more use of the tools that have been around for quite a long time, right? In the beef industry to move that bell-shaped curve in a more positive direction is quite frankly probably our rapid change opportunity, right? So if we can get more folks actually using those tools and actually putting the selection pressure on the cow herd for things that we already know are going to work, right? To improve the overall efficiency of the herd. I think more of the longer term pieces are, as I kind of mentioned, right? I think that's a neat opportunity for us to select for low methane emitting animals, right? And make sure we balance that properly with all other economically relevant traits in an index type approach. I think that's probably the more complicated piece. It's going to take time. I also think that could be fairly readily achieved if we could collect enough phenotypic data, but that's the challenge with methane is you got to get, you got to get a database of 1,000, 2,000, good estimates of methane probably, right? And so that's just something that we don't have right now in the U.S. I think other countries are working on it, even in some of that work's been done on sheep. And that's where I kind of wish, USDA and other funding agencies would take the urgency of that if we don't want to let other countries get ahead of us, right? Because we're not doing that work that we know would make a big impact.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, your point's really good about, existing tools, and we can contextualize that just a little bit with thinking about, selection index, for example. If we've got enough correlated trait data, we can build effective selection indexes against, a methane emission problem. There's other things we can do too, though, that have, we talked about the reproductive rate issue. Well, we know one of the drivers of that is, cow size and lactation potential in a nutrient restricted environment. Well, we have cow size and milk EPD already, right? So it becomes an optimization exercise. The other place, though, I think that, and you alluded to it a little bit, was, it's not just individual genetic selection, it's breeding system design too, right? And so we'll lean back on the basic training we all got as undergraduate animal genetics and animal breeding course, and that is the breeding system matters too, right? So, building maternally oriented and environmentally adapted cows, and then, mating those to market targeted bulls, leverages all the things we talk about routinely in typical production, but also favorably focuses, or potentially favorably focuses on improvements in sustainability. So I think you're exactly right. We don't have to recreate many wheels to get where we need to go.
Yes. And I think the point that you just brought up is super important, right? So I think that's the key thing is, it's probably not a very good demonstration of that, but then the beginning part of the presentation of trying to highlight there's an inverse relationship there, right, of increasing the amount of inputs we put in a system, and we can try to lower the footprint, but are we really lowering the aggregate, right? Or are we creating other potential problems? And I think that's what's important with beef is it's part of the challenge is we're trying to optimize so many different things at once. We have this extensive forage-based part of the industry that, quite frankly, is super valuable and why the beef industry can be incredibly resilient. But if you were just thinking about lowering the footprint of beef production, you would wean calves early and you would put them in the feedlot as soon as possible, right? And you would push them as fast as you can to lower the age at slaughter, because ultimately that relationship, it's pretty much the strongest relationship in terms of lowering greenhouse gas emissions per pound of beef, right? But then that presents, well, if we all did that and we still had, 80% of our cows born between January and June and everything else, I think, you begin to see all the ripple effects of such a decision that would make, right? And I think that's part of the challenge of all of this.
Yeah, great perspective. And Miranda, no problem putting it in the chat box. I just wasn't paying attention. You're all good. So other questions from Philip Lancaster, just chimed in here. Philip, thanks. Thinking feed supplements to grazing cows, we think about methane reducing feed additives being delivered daily. But there's been a lot of work delivering protein supplements every 3 to 6 days. Is there some slow release technologies being looked at for some of the methane reducing feed additives? Great question.
It is a great question, Phil. Yeah. So yes, and I think the other aspect of that is the idea of, could you put it in a bolus, right? And I say that as almost selfishly working at Elanco, right? We have that type of technology that we use more readily in other parts of the world. In Australia, for example, with Methane, and in Europe for dairy cows in Methane, right? So that's another possibility. I think your idea of, even if it is a few times a week supplement, in some cases maybe even more practical, because then you get into, again, the trade-offs with boluses is sometimes the packers don't like those when these plastic things clog up all their drains and
right.
and all the other problems associated with that you don't think about right off the bat. But yeah, I think that's where we had to get creative is so much of this research has been done on cattle fed in confinement, and it's been unappreciated. The bigger challenge is grazing animals. And so how do we think creatively about that and make sure it's practical? And I didn't mention it much, the other part of it is even this new molecule 3-NOP, 3-nitrooxypropanol, which has now just been approved down in Brazil, and I think, I can't remember if it's Chile or Argentina. It definitely works. It can reduce emissions 30% at least per animal, per head per day. But it doesn't really have a performance implication, right? And so I think this is the other interesting aspect, even from a nutritional standpoint, is where's the energy going, right? We know some of it is actually hydrogen emission from the animal, but I think there's so much opportunity there. Again, no disrespect to DSM because they've developed a really cool molecule, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to exploit what is happening with that energy. How can we capture those reducing equivalents in something more useful to the animal and potentially get a feed efficiency bump as well as a methane reduction. So
Yeah, absolutely.
Lots of things that we could do there that would make it feasible.
To route those calories or the energy to protein and fat accretion versus an alternate blow off, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And hydrogen actually does, H2 gas does have a global warming impact. So actually it kind of eats in a little bit to the benefit.
Just pushing it over there just changes it from a different category.
Right? So,
yeah. Great question, Philip. And I've wondered too about can we motivate people into other practices that we know are beneficial? So, of the thing that I thought about when Philip posted was, can we get this into, protein supplementation strategies, right? So we know during the wintertime when cows are mostly on forage and eating a lot of it, that dry forage is a source of some of that methane. Can we motivate people to do a better job supplementing cows that we know impacts subsequent reproduction and performance with an extra bait, right? So. Mm-hmm. Great. Super. Well, thanks everybody for those questions. Dare, you're always good for one too. We've got maybe a minute or two left here before we wrap up. So I want to make sure you've got a chance to chime in too. So.
Well, the only thing I was going to ask Sarah was, and you may have answered it and I just missed it, was when you talk about that emissions per head and the per pound and everything else, if you guys accounted for the fact that those cattle back in the 1960s and 70s were probably 900,000 pound cows and today they're 1,500 pound cows?
Yeah, so I didn't go into that much, but that is where I said you'd have to reduce emissions per head as well, right? So even if we were to look at the EPA data, which only goes back to 1990, it doesn't go back to when we had even smaller cows, to your point, and you look at the trends over the last 30 years, we do see an increase in emissions per head. And that's true for both dairy and for beef, right? Because we know we have larger animals, we have more productive animals, and they're eating more dry matter. And at the end of the day, dry matter intake is very highly correlated with methane emissions per head, right? So that's where, when I say, we can technically be climate neutral, but it's going to be a departure from normal. That's what I mean. It's like we actually had to reverse the trend that's been happening, right? Which is animals get larger, they eat more, they produce more methane per head, which again it's still increasing less than we're increasing output. That's why our footprint's going down. But with this new metric, what matters is the total amount that's coming from the industry, right? So we had to care about both at the same time. It's kind of akin to thinking about a water use challenge, right? If we think about the Ogallala Aquifer, right, we can improve the efficiency of use, but if we're still pulling more in aggregate total out of an aquifer, out of a given region, we still have a challenge, right? It's the same kind of relationship here of we have to think about both the total and the emissions per unit of production, right? And so, yeah, that's a great point. There's been an advantageous change of these larger animals, but there's been a cost to it too, is they emit more per animal.
Well, I think there's so much more that we can do still, because that hits the economic side of things too, because we've done a great job of reducing frame size, but we've still totally ignored mature weight. And I think it's killing us economically a bit too. So I think that's an area that could use some attention.
Yep.
Yeah. And Sarah, I think, when I get done with a webinar, I usually stop and go, okay, what were the things that sunk in and take home points? And for me, one of the biggest ones that you made today was that difference between reduced footprint, which is arguably the thinking I've been using. It's okay, we just increase relative efficiency of methane emission, right? So we get more pounds of beef per kilogram of methane emitted. But your point is that doesn't get us to neutrality, right? We gotta think differently to move the needle towards a neutrality point. So that's a really important concept, I think, for us. We did get another question here in the Q&A, and it's from Teresa, and she says, for grazing animals in California, can there be a trade-off between reducing wildfire fuels and therefore reducing carbon released in large wildfires versus emissions from grazing animals? Great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. So yes, absolutely. You can think about it as a situation where the biomass is going to get degraded in some way, right? It's either going to get super rapidly oxidized in a fire, or it can get slowly oxidized metabolically in an animal. And it's usually much more advantageous for that to happen, right, in terms of in the animal. I know I've created a slide somewhere. I was actually trying to look to see if I could find it, but I didn't. Of what is nice is California actually publishes their estimated CO2 emissions from wildfires every year. And the last several years, they've been very high, right? One of the years almost essentially exceeding all the electricity emissions that come from the state of California. So it's a very significant issue.
Oh, wow.
So yes, that is a really key point, right? And that's one of those aspects of why we can't be singularly focused on just trying to, again, move all the cattle to feed yards as soon as possible, because there's all these benefits of grazing systems and managing landscapes with ruminants, like wildfire suppression, right? They're super, super important in this whole equation.
Yeah, great question, great perspective. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Sarah, thank you again for your participation today and the time and effort and thoughtfulness you put into your presentation. I think really helps us move our thinking forward and in a positive direction, and that was the goal. And so we really appreciate your impact today. I want to spend just a second here and invite you all to our session next week. On Wednesday, October 13th is session 2, and we have 2 speakers, kind of back to our traditional format next week, and the topics are reducing environmental impact of beef production is the theme for that segment. The host will be Dr. Spangler, and the 2 speakers are Samada Fernando, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, talking about the biology of methane production. So you'll see the quite close connection between today's talk and the next ones as we kind of drill down into some of the aspects of emission production and the root of those problems. So Dr. Fernando will address the biology then, and then Dr. Jennifer Borman from here at K-State will talk about some research strategies around the genetic components of environmental impact. So we've got some work going on in the GHG space on cows, in fact, here. And so look forward to those 2 speakers next week. Again, for those of you that may be in touch with folks that missed today, we'll get those posted up at the end of the sessions and online, and make those available to everybody. And with that, again, Sarah, thanks for your participation today and the content you provided for us. And we wish you a good week. And thanks everybody for again joining, and we'll see you next week. You'll get reminders again for next week, and so we do look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much.